Welcome to Paul or Nothing, the place to get all of your Paul all of the time. Join me, your host Sam Wiles, as we discover the history, the music, and the man behind it all, Paul McCartney. To get in contact with the show, email us at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. Hello guys, hello gals, and wait for it. Welcome back to Paul or Nothing, the one-stop shop till you drop for all things McCartney. From Kanye to the Fireman, we are here to dive deeper into one of pop music's most well-known pioneers. I come before you today, my humble listeners, with yet another bonus episode. Yes, Wings at the Speed of Sound is written, it's ready, it's good to go. It's just trying to get the right guest at the right time to grace us with his presence. But today, like I say, is another bonus episode, an interview, where once again I'm essentially inviting everyone who's ever written a book that I've ever glanced at in my extensive research for this show onto said show, and using the opportunity to pick their brains and find out just how little I in turn know about Paul McCartney by comparison. I've had this episode on the back burner for quite a while now, so I'm glad that you're finally going to be able to hear it. But before we do any of that, I just need to say a few quick things in regard to housekeeping. The first thing I wanted to mention was that you're really going to have to keep your eyes peeled and your ears to the ground for the next episode of this show. It'll be out very, very soon, but it won't be an actual episode per se, but I would really appreciate you out there, the fans, to take 10-15 minutes out of your day to listen to it, because it's more about the show and the meta-reality that the show exists in general, and where I would like to take it and expand it. Yes, for those of you who haven't already guessed, Paul or Nothing will soon have a Patreon page, and the next episode is going to be our little announcement for that. The Patreon page itself is also good to go and ready. I just want to debut it with another bigger episode. I know it's not fun to listen to me prattle on about crowdfunding and tiers, but the show has the opportunity to be so much better than it is right now, be a little more slick, a little more professional, a little more regular, and I know that you two out there, well, I like to assume you'd want what's best for the show as well. So yeah, the Patreon announcement won't be too far behind this one. Watch this space. Of course, you know by now, the best way to ever get in contact with the show and even have your correspondence and letters read out on the show is to contact us at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. This is a show, don't forget, that is just as much about you, the fans, as it is me. So if you have any stories about Paul, maybe you play his music, or maybe you just want to tell me that I was too harsh on Venus and Mars. Regardless, drop us an email, like I said, at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. Follow us on the Twitter, of course, which is at McCartneyPod, which is the biggest conglomerate of our little community. It's growing every day. I love posting daily song polls, questions to the fans, gifts, and all sorts of internet mulch. That's at McCartneyPod. If you're unable to stream this or get up from your desk, you lazy sod, then you can also find the show on YouTube by either typing in Paul or Nothing or Paul McCartney Podcast. Please ignore any other shows that may be about similar topics that you may or may not see. I know I've been a bit lax with the YouTube of late, but by the time you hear this, all the episodes should be either uploaded or in the process of being uploaded. I've also just set up a Facebook account for the group. Same again, just type in Paul or Nothing. Haven't really done much with it yet, as I'm still trying to figure out how to make it a bit more worthwhile and different from the Twitter. Probably going to turn it into more of a forum where people can just talk more long form about McCartney. So I'll be looking forward to get some of those chit-chats going. And last but not least is the blog. That's paulmccartneypod@wordpress.com, which is kind of like the YouTube. It's the best place to find all things related to the show. But Sam, where are all those articles you mentioned a few episodes ago? Well, most of them are actually being turned into real episodes when I write the notes for this show. Not to get too behind the scenes or anything, but I write a lot of it quite long form. I do have quite an annoying stutter that gets mostly edited out in the editing process. But in writing long form, I essentially end up writing whole episodes worth of content out, and they don't read like proper articles, as is my writing style. I'd have to go back and redo them. And all of them are going to be turned into real bonus episodes that you'll actually get to listen to very, very soon. So again, watch this space. And again, with one fell swoop, the housekeeping is over. Woo! Now we can move on with the show. The interview you're about to hear is between me and John Blaney. His book, Lennon and McCartney, Together Alone, was one of the very first texts that I got as a source for the show. And I ploughed through it relatively quickly, absorbing as many unique quotes and as much trivia as I could. And it has remained a staple of my McCartney bookshelf ever since. So with a track record like that, I was naturally very excited to get him on the show as soon as I realised that I could regularly start booking these types of guests on my Tin Pot Back Garden Homemade podcast. To actually get the extremely hard to locate John Blaney himself on the show for me was, as always, an absolutely huge pleasure. We also had similar styles of humour, which always works out well for this type of show, and by similar types of humour, of course, I mean naff cheesy styles of humour. Like all my best guests, he can do that wonderful Rain Man-esque trivia locator in his brain, which meant he could literally talk about anything I wanted to, from McCartney 1 to New. He was there just to allow me to ramble on about Paul in the best possible way, and in the way that I'm sure you've grown accustomed to on this show. I know it's terribly trite to say that someone is nice, but he was really a very, very, very nice chap. We had a great back and forth, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. This is my interview with author John Blaney. Take it away, live version of me. Hello and welcome to the live segment. We've probably just transitioned from a very well-spoken and erudite piece from me just there. One of the elements of this show that I never really expected was the kind of ramping up of the wider reading around the subject of the Beatles and Paul McCartney that I really had to take on. I really thought I'd be able to wing it for at least 10 episodes, but you know, after writing up the notes for just 3 albums and the history and the biography of this man's life, you realise that you need to get so many perspectives just to get a glimpse of what really happened. And I've had to read quite a fair bit, as you've imagined. But, you know, one cannot invite an author onto a podcast for an interview unless you've read their work. And with the output of this show, rocky as it may be, it means I've had to read a crap ton of new books in order to scrape through said interviews without looking like a complete fool. Some of these books have been a bit of a chore and some have been very heavy. However, the chap I have on today hasn't written any books like that, at least not the ones I've read, the ones in front of me right now, the first of which, Lennon and McCartney, Together Alone, which for me was one of those books that was seemingly designed for a tosser like me to take in, absorb and regurgitate from time to time on a podcast in review sections on a show like this one. You know, starting from McCartney's 1966 project The Family Way, it takes, you know, me all the way through to 2005's Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, and it's just every single release, the dates, the times, reviews from the author himself, and it just includes all the information any collector or casual fan would need, and it's just so insightful in its critical assessments. The other, which I have here, which I just got off Amazon last week, and I've pretty much just ploughed through it in 2 days, which was called Beatles For Sale, How Everything They Touched Turned to Gold, offered me a wholly new and unique insight into an oft-forgotten element of the Beatles story, you know, the kind of trials and tribulations of how everyone was trying to leech every last penny off this massive financial industry the Beatles had built up around them. And normally you'd think that'd be quite a dreary task, and you know, that's probably why it hasn't been written about in such depth before. But it's written with such a swift pace and is absolutely jam-packed with just endless behind-the-scenes insights into something that I really wouldn't have thought I would have found so interesting to begin with. And the author here I have right now with me, his name is John Blaney, and he's written these 2 fantastic books that no doubt will be often endlessly quoted in future episodes, one probably more than the other. He is here today, like so many of the other guests on the show, simply just to have a quick chat, because you cannot talk to enough people about Paul McCartney and about the Beatles, and I just want to get as many interesting and insightful people on to do just that. And John is here to do that with me. John, how are you, my friend?
Oh, I'm doing very well, thank you. I hope you're doing well too.
Yes, we've just been having a quick chat, and I was just about to say, I've actually just been to Liverpool with my girlfriend.
Oh, yeah.
And what was clear, right as you kind of set foot in that city, is that the Beatles are such a massive commodity still. You know, there were dozens of stands, stalls, shops, museums, tours, wholly recreational sites where you can, you know, kiss the ground and hope you might have a vision.
Yeah.
And it's just to the extent that it looks like one of the main economies of the city. And, you know, is it pessimistic to say that there will be never anything remotely close in the kind of scale of popularity as the Beatles were and still are? Like, can any other group ever attain that kind of cultural impact and fame again?
I think the short answer to that is no, basically because everything has changed so much now. For a start, the record industry is on its knees. You know, people there's a resurgence in vinyl records, we are told, and last year I think there was an article in the paper that said for the first time vinyl sales have overtaken those of downloads, which sounds really promising until you actually look at the figures. And the reason that vinyl sales have overtaken downloads is because people have stopped downloading and everyone's streaming now. So the record industry has changed beyond compare from what it was in 1962. That's changed, the whole kind of social media thing. I mean, if you look at the mania that happened around the Beatles, the girls screaming and everything, which was sustained for 3 or 4 years. It did get a bit quieter as the 60s tailed off. I mean, the last band I can think that had that kind of an impact was the Bay City Rollers.
Oh, really?
Can you think of anyone else, that had girls, screaming and going wild?
No other band has that amount of stock footage of screaming women to choose from, really, do they?
No, I'm not even, there are bands like One Direction and things like that who are very popular, they play stadiums, but there's not that hysteria around it. It's changed. So no, there will never be a band as culturally significant, because the other thing about the Beatles is they were just ahead of everybody else. They were leaders. They were leading, and they were leading people. Sometimes they led at too fast a pace, but sometimes they got it just right. And they also did it in a very clever way, which, everybody could embrace it. So even when they got a little weird in 1966, 67 and started taking drugs, they nevertheless made psychedelia acceptable. Because I should imagine for a lot of people it would have been quite scary. A lot of long-haired people taking drugs and such like. So they were very clever. They were definitely leaders. They had their finger on the pulse. They were in the right place at the right time. The 4 right people came together, formed a band, had a good manager, a great recording manager, George Martin. It was just, what today we would call a perfect storm. And I don't think that storm is ever going to happen ever again.
Well, what's striking is just how well Beatles stuff sells and continues to sell. There's this constant, peak and trough every few years where some new masters are made, there's some new footage, or a new film has just been produced, like the new Ron Howard film. That was kind of bland and mediocre, but, kind of had charms. Yep. But that, of course, it came with an album, both vinyl and CD, mugs.
Yeah,
You've got a Yellow Submarine Lego kit following suit. It's kind of like The Simpsons, it's almost impossible to fathom the popularity ever waning, you can't picture culture without the Beatles now. Has Apple kind of created this self-perpetuating organism, or is it constantly maintained to make sure it's always in the public face, like McDonald's, like Nike, like Coca-Cola?
Yeah, I think Apple work fairly hard to make sure that there's always another project in the pipeline. Such as the Ron Howard film you mentioned, and then before that, the really big one was the Beatles anthology project in 95, 96, I think it was. And they were pretty savvy back in the 1960s. In America, they had the Beatles cartoons, which were shown over here, I think, in the early 70s. But see, that introduces children to the Beatles. Yellow Submarine was, the Beatles didn't like Yellow Submarine to begin with, but that was a really clever film because it's a kids film and you show it to kids today and kids love it. So that's a really good way of introducing new generations to the Beatles. And I'm sure with the 8 Days a Week film, a lot of grandparents probably took their grandchildren along and, to the cinema and introduced them to the Beatles that way. So they're quite savvy, Apple, and there's always something in the pipeline. And this year it'll be Sergeant Pepper. There'll be a reissue version of that. So you just know that there will be something. I mean, I'm not sure what exactly they're going to do, but.
And it will be charged at maximum possible price. It's going to be £19 for the Blu-ray, at least $12.99 for the DVD. It's there's never a cheap Beatles product out. And
no, and if I could just say that again is deliberate. The Beatles are the Rolls Royce of pop groups. Okay, and if you want a Rolls Royce, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So they've deliberately, there have been a couple of budget albums, there were a couple that slipped through, but they deliberately price everything at a premium rate because, you know, as Paul McCartney says, you know, they are the greatest band in the world, and you don't want to undersell yourself. And if you start, you know, putting albums out at $4.99, it does kind of, you know, undervalue all that work that you've put into building this brand that's the best.
So, John, just for the sake of our listeners who might be unfamiliar with you or your work, how long have you been writing books about the Beatles then, John?
Well, the first book came out, I think it must be about 18 years ago. I was looking around for a Paul McCartney discography, and there weren't any up-to-date Paul McCartney discographies. So I thought, well, it's up to me to do it then. So I set about writing that book, which unbelievably I had to self-publish because I couldn't get anybody interested in it for various reasons.
Well, self-publishing is so prevalent these days with like Amazon and stuff like that. It's almost like there is no quenching the thirst for new Beatles material. Do you ever worry that there will be a moment where you'll find yourself running out of topics or going too obscure or too left field?
Well, yes, I think is the answer to that. I mean, I've done a Paul McCartney book, and then obviously the logical follow-up to that was a book about John Lennon. And actually, what happened then was you mentioned the book Together Alone. Well, I got a publishing deal with a company called Backbeat, and they said, well, what we'd like to do is combine the two books. So my first two books became the third book, which was Together Alone. And then I thought, I don't want to do any more books about the Beatles. You know, I've kind of had enough of that. And that was a bad thing to think, because Backbeat then came along and said, oh, we'd like you to write a book about the Beatles, about their business. And they kind of waved a check in front of my...
Oh,
you see,
fantastic.
They commissioned me to write the Beatles For Sale book. And then I thought, no, that's it. I'm not going to do another one. That's enough Beatles. And I actually then started to write a book about another of my interests, which was the London pub rock scene in the early 1970s and its influence on the new wave scene, the punk new wave scene of the late 70s. So I kind of write about what I'm interested in, really.
Yes, you've also got one about George Harrison now as well.
Yeah, 2 volumes of that. You see, I'm a sucker for all this stuff. You know, I started off writing it, and I thought this is going to be too big to do as 1 volume. You know, so it's a 2-volume set. It's about 700 pages in total. It's an encyclopedia look at George Harrison's solo recordings, really.
Would you ever consider working on a Ringo Starr career compendium? Would that be a topic?
Well, people have said, "Oh, you've got to do a Ringo book." But the trouble with Ringo is, you know, he's a great drummer and he's certainly a very interesting character. But he's not a songwriter, really. Most of his albums are either full of cover versions or songs that have been written by other people for him.
Yeah, you're not exactly biting at the bit to write off about Back Off Boogaloo.
Not really. I mean, what can you know? I really don't think there's an awful lot that can be said about Ringo Starr's.
And then, you know, you've got to do the George Martin book, the Billy Preston book, the Eric Clapton book.
Well, actually, you see, yeah, sorry to interrupt, but Billy Preston is someone who I would really like to do a book about.
Oh, really?
I think he had a fantastic career. I mean, I don't know if we're diverging here. I mean, he was in the Beatles for a very short period, and he's the only musician to ever get credited on a label. But he had a fantastic career because he started about 12.
Oh.
And he played with people like Mahalia Jackson. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her. She was a gospel singer. He played with Nat King Cole, Ray Charles, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Roxy Music. The list is endless. And he was also something of a troubled soul because he was gay at a time when you really had to stay in the closet. I don't think he ever really came out. Poor old.
Well, that is something I did not know until you just told me, actually.
Yeah, he was gay, and towards the end of his life, he also had a really horrible drug addiction as well, and ended up his life ended. It was a really sad end to his life. But it would make a fantastic book, if someone wants to sit down and write it. Maybe I'll sit down and write it sometime. But he's a great musician, fantastic keyboard player. If you haven't got any of his albums, really go out and get some. They're all good. The really early ones he recorded in the 1960s, are real great soul R&B numbers, and then he developed later on into a really good songwriter, So Billy Preston's fantastic. Love him.
I'm looking forward to appearing in on the special thanks page. What would be a good first album to get into Billy Preston?
Well, actually, he recorded 2 albums for Apple that were produced by George Harrison. So I would say Encouraging Words is a really good album if you can get that. Yeah. And Billy Preston also recorded and released My Sweet Lord about 6 months before George Harrison did.
Oh, I've heard that. It's a very good version, yeah.
Yes, great version, yeah. And That's the Way God Planned It. That was a big hit. There's lots and lots of interesting stuff in Billy Preston's back pages, yeah. Mm.
Now, I'd like to get a few kind of foundation questions, just kind of out of the way, to get a few quick broad stroke pictures, if you will. It's going to be a little quick fire section.
All right, go on then.
Say the first thing that comes to your mind, John.
Yeah, okay.
What's your earliest memory of the Beatles?
I think hearing them on the radio, my memory is I was probably driving with my dad and he had the car radio on, and my memory is hearing them sing Yellow Submarine on the radio. Yellow
Submarine, good first song to a...
Yeah, yeah.
What is the Beatles song you listen to the most?
Oh dear, Strawberry Fields Forever.
Oh, interesting choice. What is your favourite Beatles album?
Ooh, Abbey Road.
Abbey Road seems to be popular with a lot of people. There's always this little cynical edge to me where I kind of feel there's a bit of an artifice that it was. I feel like The Last Hurrah could have been a little stronger. It's
I don't know. I think it's considering the relationships within the band were really bad at the time.
It's still phenomenal. It's still Beatles, It's still Beatles level phenomenal, but you kind of have to rank them in a league of their own, really.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What's your favourite Paul McCartney album?
Band on the Run.
Solid choice. No one can ever deride you for that one.
You can't go wrong with that album.
Would you agree that it's up there in terms of a Beatles album in quality?
I would say it's one of the top 10 best pop albums of all time. It's up there. It's up there with Dark Side of the Moon. I don't know, Kate Bush's debut album. All those pop classics. It's up there in the top 10, definitely.
Favourite John Lennon album?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I'm going to say Imagine. Although, see, Plastic Ono Band as well. I really like Plastic Ono Band. I'm going to say Imagine.
No one's ever said Double Fantasy yet. I'm not sure if anyone ever will.
Well, I'm of the age. I remember that album coming out, and I remember looking forward to it. Like, this is, because I just got into the Beatles about the time he stopped recording, and there was that long gap, and there was nothing, and then there was all this what we today would call media hype about the album and John Lennon's recording. Oh, it's all really exciting and fantastic. And when the album came out, I was so disappointed. It was such a letdown for me at the time.
It's a pretty good Yoko Ono album and a terrible John Lennon album.
Yeah, I think you're right. I really preferred the Yoko Ono songs at the time because they were a lot more driving and cutting edge, and Lennon's stuff was a bit wishy-washy. But he tended to do that. He did that with Mind Games. Whenever he was uncertain about making a comeback or something. He always played it really safe, which is a bit disappointing for John Lennon. But there you go.
Yeah. In preparation for this episode, I read a couple of reviews of your books online, and what you've just said about Yoko kind of just made me think of that. And I remember what one critic said, that you were quite soft on a lot of the more experimental stuff, like Two Virgins or Wedding Music or Unfinished Music. And do you feel like you have a soft spot for that kind of stuff?
Well, yeah, you see, I mean, my background is in art history. I mean, I've got a master's degree in history of art, you see, and I spent 4 years studying 20th century art, and I have an interest in that whole kind of Fluxus. Fluxus was a loose movement that came out in New York in the late 1950s. Lots of people, artists, musicians came out of it, and I find it incredibly interesting. And I also find it very interesting what the Lennons were trying to do with their art, because the whole point of Fluxus is there's a reciprocity between the artist and the audience. Okay, so that's the whole idea of this unfinished music, is you or I can add to it. We can add to it in our imagination, or if you wanted to, you could go and physically add to it. You could get some recording tape and put some more noises on it. That's the whole point of it. They really wanted to engage with their audience. Now, unfortunately, with all that kind of modern art, lots and lots of people find it very difficult to understand. And that's why when you go to art galleries, they'll have a white square on the wall, and there'll be 1,000 words of explanation.
Well, it's funny you should bring that up, because on that same trip to Liverpool, we actually went to the Tate, and me and my girlfriend, we go to so many art galleries. It's a real pleasure of ours. We like to go discuss it like we're in a Wes Anderson movie, and we got there, and it was the most stereotypical kind of modern art. Doesn't resonate with the weird out-of-towners, and I just honestly felt like it was a joke trying to antagonise me as a guy who might just like a classic Turner painting or something. And there was some shoes in a box. There was a mattress in one of the corners. There was a brick on a podium. It was some real challenging stuff for my sentiments, and I found myself getting increasingly frustrated.
Who was the artist?
Oh, I did not bother to remember any of their names at all. There was one installation where there was random screens hanging down, flickering, and there was kind of like this kind of new agey pastoral poetry being read, and there was like two robots going around kind of chanting, and a cyborg dog doing a backflip. And it just said, "The artist is interested in how we interact with technology in our environment." And I just wept. In kind of an anger that someone thought I'd buy this. Like,
yeah, I do have some sympathies there, and a lot of the time it is the emperor's new clothes. And I remember actually sitting through lectures when I was at art college and thinking, this is just rubbish. They're just making up as they go along. But coming back to the Lennons, I think they were sincere in what they were trying to do. It's just that the majority of people, it just left them cold. I think it was a brave move, but unfortunately it didn't work.
Yeah, I really see little art in them, because I was quite shocked when you kind of favoured that, but didn't like something like Check My Machine off McCartney 2, which I think is one of his most contemporary songs. I think it's aged fantastically. It's a wonderful little track, and I always love when I get authors on and I go through their Beatles books and find out what songs they didn't like, because that kind of Beatles conversation of, it rewards fact-checking and having a wide breadth of knowledge. And it's like, oh, you didn't like this song off Red Rose Speedway. Oh, well, I did like that one off Wildlife. And there were quite a few that I thought I'd take a little bit of umbrage with.
Well, actually, I listened to Check My Machine only the other day, actually. I was listening to the McCartney 2 album again.
Yeah, I had just got it on vinyl in that. Sorry to bring back to this same Liverpool trip again, but in the Beatles shop, McCartney 2 and this single were going together for £10.
Bargain.
Yeah, I asked why it was so cheap, and they said because it's rubbish. And I was like,
I listened to that album, as I say. I think it was just a few days ago, and to describe it as rubbish is doing it a huge injustice. I mean, I think it's actually not a bad album. I mean, that track "Bogey Music" that is rubbish. I mean, that's
yes. It's got one of those definite kind of McCartney side one's great, and then side two's just okay. Yeah, we've clearly run out of ideas. And Chess My Machine's not on it.
No, that was a B-side originally. That was a B-side.
Waterfall.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot on the McCartney 2 Deluxe Edition that probably would have done better.
Yeah.
On the actual album, like Frozen Jap's a bit meh. I think it's Frozen Japanese now on the reissues.
Oh yeah. Well, he changed it for the Japanese market when the album was released. So when it was released in Japan in 1980, it actually was titled Frozen Japanese because he didn't want to offend them, having already offended them by taking in lots of marijuana.
Yes.
Or was that afterwards? I can't remember now, but it's around that.
I believe so, yeah. That's kind of like the last defiant act of the super arrogant stoner McCartney, but it's a side of him that will always endear him very, very close to my heart. Are you not a fan of Bip Bop off Wildlife?
Bip Bop? No, actually, I think so. Again, Wildlife. I think it's got a lot going for it, actually, and I think it would be quite high up in my list of favourite McCartney albums. But for me, I think it's side 2 of that album that's the best.
I Am Your Singer is one that I have a definite soft spot for.
Yeah,
I've gone on far too long talking about how I dislike Mumbo.
Yeah,
one of the bigger missteps. It's like, we are launching the good ship Wings, and it's with this terrible debut track.
Yeah, I think if he'd have flipped sides, if side 2 had been side 1, then that would have been a far better introduction. Because even Wildlife, I don't think that's a particularly great song. But then again, Dear Friend is. That's a lovely song.
It could have been an accident at the factory. We'll never know.
Yeah,
we'll never know.
No, it's just Paul McCartney getting it wrong.
Yes, getting it wrong almost as many times as getting it right.
Yeah, definitely.
So for the sake of brevity, I'll just kind of break it down to discuss the 2 books, because I've basically sent you hopefully a little bit of money in the post for these 2 books.
Oh, I wouldn't count on that. I've yet to see a royalty for either of those, but don't worry about that. It's keeping the publisher going anyway. So,
of course. On a lighter note. My copy of Lennon and McCartney Together Alone is actually from the Park Forest Public Library, Park Forest, Illinois. So I have no idea how it's made its way all the way back to Coventry, but it's a nice little piece.
It's well travelled.
Yeah. This is like I've said, it's one of those books that is kind of purpose made for a podcast like this, where I can just go through everything. I can find a quote for each episode, and it's perfect in that sense.
What you want,
I like the cover. It's kind of the composite 50-50 of their faces, and it's kind of indicative of how the book was created. So the McCartney book was written first, and then there was a solo Lennon one. Yeah. And did you have to make any final amendments to the book before?
There were, it actually, I was quite surprised when I did the first draft of combining the 2 books of how well they worked together. And then the thing that did annoy me about that book, and I'm going to say it now on air, is that there are several mistakes that were inserted by the person who edited it. And and such is the way with these things. A copy popped through my letterbox, and I opened it up, and the first thing I noticed was a mistake. So I got on the phone to the publishers, and I said, "Oh, thanks for sending the proof copy that I was supposed to get 10 days to go through this and check all the mistakes." I said, "I've noticed a number of mistakes. Can you correct them?" And they said, "No, that's not the proof. That's the finished book." So I wasn't particularly happy at that point, particularly when there were a number of mistakes that were inserted by someone other than me. But
my sympathies.
But that's the way it goes. You live and you learn. So
Can you remember what that first mistake was? Was it a date or a claim? Or
I think it was something fairly trivial. It was probably a date or a catalogue number, and there are certain paragraphs that were kind of rewritten, which have got obvious mistakes in them. But if you haven't spotted them, I'm not going to tell you.
Did you ever consider ending it at Lennon's death and kind of keeping it about them two as a pair and like a unit, or was it always going to go on with Solo McCartney?
Yeah, I think actually that would have been a good idea, really. I don't know why we didn't think of it. We should have just taken it up to, say, well, maybe Milk and Honey, perhaps. We could have taken up to maybe the early 80s. But yeah, because obviously once Lennon dies, all you really get is a lot of archival material and best ofs and compilations.
Yeah, you're just kind of killing time till Free as a Bird.
Yeah.
Till Free as a Bird comes out. Do you feel like, since you kind of wrote them both separately, and it kind of allowed you to write them in a separate detail without having to consider them being informed by the other too much, did that mean you could kind of be less biased and just kind of focus on them one at a time? Like, do you feel like your opinions on them would change if you were writing a Lennon and McCartney book?
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I think it would. Yeah, because obviously you'd have to take the relationship into account. I think a lot more. If you write them, as individual books, then you're just basically focusing on the one of them and ignoring the other. So I think it would be a completely different book if I'd set out from the start to write a book about Lennon and McCartney. I think it would be a very different book from the one that we finally came out with. Yeah.
Do you really feel like it's possible to write about one of them without bringing up the other at some point? It's almost not an if but a when, really.
No, I think you're always going to at some point refer to one of the other Beatles. In the George Harrison book, John Lennon and Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, they all crop up, because they would be writing songs about one another, or they'd be inspired by one another, even though they supposedly weren't, talking to one another. They were, they were very close. It was like a family, really. I think they were that close. They were like brothers. Yeah.
Is it even fair to kind of like compare McCartney and Lennon's career? We've just talked about their kind of staggeringly different release schedules around that time. McCartney's output just kind of dwarfs his at that point, and their careers had very different work ethics and goals, and they kind of wanted different outcomes from their new post Beatles experience.
Yeah,
and it kind of makes Lennon's impact kind of a little harder to quantify. Like, if McCartney does take more risks by making more albums, and he has more flops, but for every sort of 2 Wild Lives we get a Band on the Run, which is worth it. And the sad thing about Lennon is after those first 2 albums, there's a lot of stinkers, really. Rock and Roll is probably the key one there. And
well, I'd have to take issue with you there, because I think Rock and Roll works quite well. I think perhaps the overall sound of it is a little bit dated. But the thing about that album, I think, that strikes me even to this day is there is so much energy and excitement that just jumps off that record. You can tell that when they were making it, they were having a ball in the studio. And that was the whole point of it, really, because when Lennon started making that, which was 1973, he was kind of coming out of a fairly deep depression, and the idea was to have some fun, and that's what that album is. It's fun. You put it on, and it's a rock and roll album. It doesn't say anything other than let's have a good time.
I was always kind of disappointed by the song track listing for that album, and then when you find out that there was legal disputes and certain pressures to include certain songs from certain artists on the album, it makes you wonder that there probably would have been a better album if it had been truly all John Lennon's own personal picks, and perhaps there would have been a more kind of cohesive and maybe a personal sound on it. It just isn't much to write home about.
Yeah, I mean, and interestingly, you mentioned that. I mean, I think what they could do, the Lennon estate, if they seem to always kind of miss the obvious things, is put out an expanded version of the rock and roll album, because there are loads of songs that have appeared on various compilations over the years that were intended, or at least recorded, during those rock and roll sessions, which would, as you say, put that album in a completely different light. And I can't believe that these estates, they don't do things like that. It just it's crying out for an expanded edition, and they don't do it. I don't know why.
Yeah, the big one for me is a redone Red Rose Speedway, the double album with all of it, and the James Paul McCartney TV special. It comes in on a DVD as well. It'd be absolutely perfect. We just spoke about, what if you'd done the book as a single volume about Lennon and McCartney. On the topic of, coming down, more one-sided perhaps, who do you feel like you would have favoured more?
Oh,
I guess that's just a fancy way of me saying, are you a Lennon or a McCartney man?
Yeah.
No pressure based on the title of the show.
I'm actually, I'm going to have to say Lennon. Just because he was.
Do you feel like you have to defend that choice often? Or?
It's funny, isn't it? Because I mean, really, they're equals, And I think I go through phases, As I say, I just listened to McCartney 2 the other day. I can't remember the last time I actually put a John. Oh yes, I can. I mean, a few months earlier, I put on I listened to Walls and Bridges, and I thought, I quite like this album. So I go through phases, and I think possibly it's because McCartney's kind of stuck around for the last, whatever it is, 50 years, and John Lennon obviously disappeared in 1980, and there's always that what if, what if he'd still been around. And
who are you more drawn to when you were in your youth, shall we say?
In my youth, I think it probably was Lennon. Mm-hmm. Although, again, you say that, I think it was because Lennon was so distant, because, I saw McCartney in 1979. I saw the very last Wings tour, and it was it was relatively easy to go and see Paul McCartney. And he's kind of it's kind of like he's always been there. It's like a bit like David Bowie in a way. It's like he's just someone who's ever present, almost omnipresent. Whereas Lennon wasn't. Lennon was this kind of distant, romantic myth. Right? Sorry.
Oh no.
No, good. Sorry. This kind of myth, a mythical figure. And
how was the Wings gig? Where was that?
It was Wembley Arena.
Did he play Coming Up?
Yeah, he did.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah,
I absolutely cannot wait to review that song. Something I've noticed a lot in Beatles books recently, especially in things like Mark Lewisham's Revolution in the Head, or I can't remember who wrote it, but it was just called Beatles songs. There's this kind of decimalisation on part of the songwriting credits of Lennon and McCartney in these songbooks. So Lennon wrote a third of Eleanor Rigby, and Paul wrote 40% of In My Life.
Yeah.
And do you feel like it was more like mercurial than that, or do you think people just need to kind of get some semblance of the exact percentages? Because it almost seems unnecessary, but because it is just the Lennon and McCartney stamp.
I mean, the fact is there are only two people who know what percentage of what songs they wrote. One of those is dead, and the other one can't remember. So does it matter? No, they're Lennon McCartney songs. I could care two hoots who wrote the middle eight to In My Life. Doesn't matter to me. The Lennon McCartney songs is the same as it would be, Strummer and Jones or Jagger and Richards. who wrote the most of Satisfaction? Don't know, don't care. It doesn't really matter. They're great songs. That's the important thing. They're great songs. They worked together. They were a team. I guess people will always wonder who did what, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day.
Yeah, I can't tell if it's over-intellectualising it or under-intellectualising it.
Yeah, good point. I'd say under, actually.
George Martin always kind of said that Yoko for John, nor Linda for Paul were ever kind of suitable replacements as songwriting partners. But do you feel like either of the two post-Beatles, songwriting partners for the lads brought much merit to the table? Or do you kind of feel like they were kind of hampered by their wives' inclusions on?
I don't think they were hampered because let's face it, both wives feature fairly prominently in their husbands' solo careers, don't they? Really, which is an interesting kind of fact in itself. I mean, they were certainly no substitutes for George Martin, and Linda was no substitute for John, and Yoko was no substitute for Paul.
I just listened to Cook of the House today.
Oh yeah,
and it's such a flop. I was actually when I was interviewing Howard Soons, he decried the song as well, and I kind of defended it. But looking back now, I'm not too sure why I did. And you will go through a Plastic Ono album, and for me, I don't know how ignorant this sounds, but I feel like I'm paying for a John Lennon album, and I don't want to particularly be paying for a Yoko Ono album. And
I agree.
You do feel robbed. It feels stunted of more songs that you could just enjoy, even if they're just offcuts from a rock and roll type album. I'd rather have that than a Yoko Ono song.
I agree. Actually, I mean, I think Lennon would have been better served if he had if kept Yoko at an arm's length kind of thing. But I suppose that was the nature of their relationship. Again, we'll never truly know what it was like, but I think it also shows a lot of generosity on Lennon's half, to let this weird Japanese woman have half your album. Because he didn't need to. He did, that Double Fantasy album, we know that he had at least another half a dozen good songs of his own that featured on Milk and Honey that he could have done. He could have put that out, and it would have been a much better album without the Yoko one. Actually, it wouldn't, would it? Because we've just said I preferred the Yoko songs. But you know what I'm saying? He could have done a John Lennon album and just said to Yoko, well, you go and do a Yoko album.
Yeah, it's almost like an avant-garde live performance piece where he's just proving how much he can do and still not sink his own ship.
Yeah.
He's still on top. It's very much a Kanye, Kim Kardashian type move.
Yeah.
The book is kind of aimed not just at Beatle fact files in terms of its background, but it's also there for the collectors of music, namely vinyl.
Yeah.
Which makes me beg the question, as you just mentioned it earlier. Are you a fan of collecting vinyl and the like?
Oh yes, I spend far too much money on vinyl records. I never got rid of my record player. I always continued to buy vinyl. I've got far too many CDs as well. I like CDs. There's nothing wrong with CDs. They sound fantastic, as do records. But I mean, there is something special about a 12-inch record. That's.
There is.
Yeah.
There's something shamanic, really. You'll be hard pressed to convince me about the CD, though. Do you have any valuable pieces in your collection? Any rare vinyls or original pressings or anything?
Oh, one or two. I won't tell you what I've got because it'll just make you sick.
Oh, really?
But all I'll say is that I used to work in a record shop from when did I start? I think it was about 1979, probably through the 1980s. And the EMI reps, all I'll say is the EMI reps were very generous in giving me very nice free records.
I'm just picturing, you've got Robert Johnson's Secret second album.
It's kind of I've got some McCartney test pressings, got some Lennon test pressings. I used to get given all the promos, all that kind of stuff. So
some lovely stuff for a rainy day on the financial markets.
Yeah, yeah.
Obviously, the book has a lot of historical factual elements, but what makes it kind of cool for me is the review element.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's put with all the releases. And when writing this, did you kind of intend to go in as objectively as possible for each album, or was it really kind of meant to just be you throwing your cards on the tables and it was your kind of raw opinions?
No, it's me throwing my cards on the table and saying, this is my view. If you disagree with it, I'm quite happy for you to disagree with it. It's just my opinion, and you will have your own opinion, and go off and make it.
You are objectively wrong when you decried Get on the Right Thing, but I will have to look the other way on that one.
Well, I think we're going to fall out because I really don't like Red Rose Speedway. I've had this argument with a friend who he's like you. He's a massive fan of Red Rose Speedway. He thinks it's brilliant. And I think
it's not brilliant, but it's not the album that people really, really think it is.
Yeah.
I remember kind of before the vinyl boom came back in, I bought Red Rose Speedway for £2.50.
Yeah.
Just because it was that cheap, no one cared. That's a good £15 album now, and no one cares about it. And it just shows again the power of the McCartney brand. Mm. Yes, you do have things like When the Night, but I've got a soft spot for Power Cut and Hold Me Tight. So,
well, if nothing else, it's got my love, and as I think I said in the book, as far as I'm concerned, that's some of the best ensemble playing that Wings as a band ever produced, and that guitar solo by Henry McCulloch, God rest his soul, is fantastic.
It was the only song from that album to appear on Wings' Greatest. Something we've already brought up ad nauseum on this show before is that kind of certain songs that you would never have had a chance in hell of liking before will, after several re-listens of an album, perhaps whilst doing research of said album, perhaps you can sympathise, it will compromise your judgment and worm its way into your good books. Have you experienced anything similar with any McCartney or Lennon songs?
Oh, probably, yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, I've always had a soft spot for Mull of Kintyre, which that gets derided. And
I loved it from the first moment. I didn't.
Yeah.
I guess it's one of those things like it was so big that there is that inevitable lashback where it is cool to dislike it. But again, I've spent far too long defending Wonderful Christmas Time, so I know the struggles of defending kind of corny McCartney. We'll just move on to your other book, Beatles for Sale, How Everything They Touched Turned to Gold. This is one I've just been throwing myself into, really. And one of the things that kind of caught my attention was something you wrote right at the start of the book. You kind of cite that the men in suits and ties being the main offenders in the breakup of the Beatles. And I thought it was a great stage setter in a sense, as it kind of really makes you question this whole unglamorous side of the Fab Four. And it's possible, in fact, because, for most people, myself included, would have just been more inclined to blame the Yoko Ono element, the death of Brian Epstein, or even, just the Fab Four changing as people. Mm. Do you still feel like, these behind-the-scenes money men were still the main cause of their downfall?
Yeah, I do, actually. There must have been huge tensions within that band, particularly towards the end, relating to their financial positions and all the politics that went along with those kind of financial shenanigans, and they were sorely let down by certain people who should probably remain nameless. I think a lot of those men in suits were extremely short-sighted. They wanted to make a fast buck, and they didn't think that the Beatles were going to still be around, 30, 40, 50 years later. And I think they sold them down the river, basically.
Where do you think that point was where they went from just being guys in a band to being businessmen? Was it the founding of Apple? Or does it go back even further, to that bit where there's that sentiment of we just want to write our own songs to, oh, wow, we can make a lot more money if we write our own songs, and everything kind of just starts spiraling from there?
I think it is possibly dependent on which Beatle you're thinking about, because I think George Harrison was very business minded and was very conscious that he had to have a business head because it wasn't going to last long. And in fact, there's that really famous piece of film of the Beatles in 1963, and Ringo Starr saying he wants a chain of hairdressing salons. And George Harrison says, well, if we're lucky, we'll be here for another 18 months. So I think they were thinking about the business side of things even then. Now, how clearly they were thinking, or whether they had a vision of what they actually wanted, that's the important thing. They were riding the crest of a wave. They were having the time of their lives. They were being worked like dogs, right? How anyone could actually sit down and take 5 minutes and think, now, what do I want out of this? And how am I going to get it? That's the difficult part. And I think it took them a long time to actually work out what it was they wanted and how they were going to get that. And as you mentioned, I think, Apple was the result of that. This thing called a partnership where they were all going to share alike. But even that, as we know, didn't go according to plan.
That's one of those best of intentions moments, isn't it?
Yeah.
This whole financial section in the Beatles story represents a kind of de-romanticisation within the narrative, leading up to their latter era and breakup.
Definitely.
You like to think of the Beatles sat around campfires with guitars and long hair, but when you think about how many people have a vested interest in keeping these guys current and keeping these guys producing content, it gets borderline conspiratorial with the amount of interest big business and record labels had in them. And it just seemed to me that the book was an interesting barometer to kind of mark how the music industry was with other bands at that time as well. It just stood out to me how unremarkable a lot of the nastier, seedier, more exploitative elements of the band's early history was, just for any artist back then, really. They were getting pence for every single, every album.
Yeah.
And then nine tenths of that goes to the tax man.
Yeah.
And, you hear stuff in politics today where people say the rich should be taxed to a greater extent. And then we look back just 40 years and we are on the side of George Harrison when he's singing Taxman. Yeah. We are right behind him. So it creates an interesting dynamic there. But as you mentioned earlier, you were commissioned to write the book. You were presented with a big check by a lady in a bikini, and you couldn't say no.
Well, it wasn't a very big check, but it was okay.
Money's money.
Money's money. Yeah.
And how long did you think it would take you? Did you think it was going to be a long research period into a book like this?
I was given a deadline. I had a year to do it in. I was working full time. I would come home and I would have my dinner and I would sit at the computer for 4 hours, 5 nights a week, and then I would spend all weekend on it. And I had to write write and research a chapter a month for a year.
Yeah, you can kind of tell that in the narrative of it. There are these kind of separate elements. There's the media, and then there's them in film. And there's Apple. Yeah. And each on its own has this little self-contained story. But I did appreciate how the opening chapters did have that historical sequence of events. Was the familiar Hamburg, and then back Liverpool, and then Rise, and then it starts jumping back and forth when you're kind of in the thick of it.
Yeah. I think it works okay like that. I mean, I think if you'd have tried to approach it any other way, it really would have got far too complicated. So the simplest thing to do was to look at the publishing as a chapter. We'll have a chapter on publishing. That chapter might start in 1963 and go to 1970, but at least it's a self-contained. If you started putting all those chunks of information in other chapters, I think it would get really confusing, which might drive the point home of how confusing it must have been for the Beatles.
Yeah, they must have just been so overwhelmed at the kind of early Beatlemania outset, because obviously record companies are going to look after the Beatles. They're not going to be paying for their own accommodation in these hotels and the food and stuff. So they're kind of just sitting on this money, hoping for a giant pot when they get back home. And after the tax man, after your rent and all of your bills and stuff, obviously they were only just earning more than a regular wage in the UK at that time, maybe a little bit more. And obviously, it's this sort of story, at least from their perspective, about realising one's own true worth and potential worth, and then not having others exploit that, whilst also trying to get as much as you can for yourself. Almost slightly selfish manner that's never really delved into that much in any media, really. But we even kind of sympathise with them in the sense that we know it's that classic archetype of what are the two elements that will break up any strong male friendship, and that's women and that's money.
Yeah,
it's the two classic things that seem to break up the Beatles. And obviously, you had a year to do this. Obviously, you've got to cram all of this knowledge. Did you feel like, when you'd learned all of this in such a short space of time, that there was a genuine sense of avarice or greed in the Fab Four? Or, is it genuinely a story about a fair share for good work?
I would say that it's fair share, for good work. I don't think any of them are particularly greedy. McCartney is certainly likes money, and McCartney does not like to lose money on a project.
He did do that thing when he signed back on with EMI, and they were trying to coax him back, and he ended up getting more royalties per Beatles album sold. And I know that incensed the estates of Lennon, Harrison, and Starkey.
Yeah. Well, he did that as well. He went out on tour, I think it was in the 1980s, and I think his financial people hadn't done their sums properly, and it looked like they were going to lose money on this world tour, which sounds ridiculous, but there you go. So he said, all right, we'll stick another 20 dates on the end of it. And he did. And he'll do that. Rather than lose money, he'll go out and, work a bit harder so he makes a profit. Now, that's McCartney. Whereas Lennon, I think, Lennon didn't really seem too concerned about money. But I mean, Lennon was another kind of person who liked to spend other people's money if he could. So I don't know. They're a funny bunch when it comes to finances. And Harrison, of course, he was also very money focused. And but then he got ripped off twice because his second manager famously disappeared with a huge pot of money.
Yeah, you can always tell George Harrison's estate has these kind of strongest litigation, because if you want to find like the chords to say something or My Sweet Lord, you will not find them online for free.
Oh, right.
You can find Beatles songs,
yeah,
but you will not find Here Comes the Sun, for example.
Uh-huh.
So obviously that's Olivia Harrison making sure those George Harrison chord books sell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny as well, because I just love how the Beatles' methods of annoying each other after they reach this state of comfort and wealth is that since they are now in effect corporations embodied in a person,
yeah,
and the way they can get at each other now is to financially niggle at each other. It just seems like a wonderful way for them to continue this kind of little diatribe they've got going, because they're never going to sue each other into a black hole, but they can always just put that pressure on the other, that they can make their voices heard. And even realise this in the very first episode, but one of the things that stands out both in your book and in a lot of publications is the sheer power of the Paul McCartney law team that just seems to be unstoppable almost at every turn, really.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point there, because I mean that's all part of the kind of relationship of brothers. Occasionally you like to wind your brother up for no other reason than because he's your brother, and if they could do that financially or however, and then I think they'd do it, and then they'd make up afterwards. They were always friends, but it's a very good way of can you imagine how wound up Paul McCartney would be if he learnt that George Harrison had just got £100 million for signing to Warner Brothers? He'd be what? George, what's that?
He's not worth that.
Yeah, you can just see it. Well, if he's got 100 million, then I want 200 million to sign with Columbia. And so it goes on.
for another album called Even Newer or something like that.
Yeah.
And on that terrible pun note, John, I just thought I'd give you the opportunity to tell us about any upcoming projects you're working on or anything you foresee coming out in the future at all.
I'm working.
It doesn't have to be Beatles related. I know you have wider interests out there.
Well, okay. Well, my other main interest is I run a record label called Mega Dodo, and you get brownie points if you know where that comes from. Mega Dodo. Any ideas?
Is that like a Dungeons and Dragons villain or something?
No. Shall I tell you?
Yes, please do.
Okay, Mega Dodo. I'm a huge fan of Douglas Adams. Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a favourite.
Oh, okay.
And it's Mega Dodo Publications in the Douglas Adams book. So that's where Mega Dodo comes from. And I run it as a record label, and I release contemporary, I guess you'd call it psychedelic, acid folk kind of stuff. And we put out a few archival releases. Just about to release an unreleased album by Brinsley Schwartz, who were one of those pub rock bands in the early 70s, and we've got album coming out by Alison O'Donnell, who was in a band called Mellow Candle, who have a very collectible album. If you see an original copy of the Mellow Candle album, then snap it up. It's about £1,000 if you can find one. Mega Dodo is that keeps me busy. Really, that keeps me busy.
It's a cracking name. I hope it doesn't go as extinct as the real bird.
One day it will. I'll see to it. I'll see to it that one day. Yeah.
Yes, I will make sure I put a lot of links and stuff in the description.
That'd be great. Yeah, thanks for that.
I hope both for you, John, and the listeners out there, this wasn't too rambling, and I'd just like to talk Beatles, really. And
yeah, no, thanks. It's been good, and it always is. To talk to a fellow admirer of the Beatles. It's always nice, and you get different views and different perspectives on things. And I will go away after this, and I'll dig out my copy of Red Rose Speedway and see if I can reevaluate.
I'm going straight back to McCartney 2. And
yeah.
I mean, one thing I did want to ask you is, why is it so hard to find you, John Blaney? There's no website, there's no wiki entry. I did end up finding you on, is it the Facebook page that you run personally?
Yeah. Why haven't I got a website? I'm too busy running Mega Dodo, actually. That's probably what it is. I'm running other people's websites and Facebook pages. I mean,
does Mega Dodo have a Twitter at least?
It does, but even that, you see, it's not actually under the sign on. It's not at Mega Dodo. It's actually at Mordecai Smith.
Someone out there was already a big Dodo fan, and
no, I did it wrong. Really, I set the account up wrong. In the early days of Twitter, I thought, well, I'll be clever, and I didn't realise that when you signed up to the account, it was that important to have, at Mega Dodo. So there you go. That's my fault. I'm absolutely hopeless at it. Yeah, I don't know really. I suppose I should have a website. I did have for a while. I had a blog where I used to publish reviews and articles and things like that, but it got infected somehow. And I just thought, well, I can't be bothered to fiddle about with this, so I just closed it down.
I know how you feel about that. There is no shortage of Beatles podcasts nor Paul McCartney ones. I actually discovered 2 new Paul McCartney podcasts literally about 10 minutes after I recorded my first episode. But hey, when I did my Tom Waits podcast, there was one other Tom Waits podcast out there, and we quite happily ground it out of existence. So I've got enough ego to kind of carry me through a couple of opponents. But yeah, John, it's been wonderful having you on, mate.
Well, thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's been nice talking. Yeah, thank you.
It's a wonderful building a nice little Avengers team of Beatles authors. Hopefully we'll be fighting off an ancient space demon soon. John, we might even have you back on for one of our album reviews in the future. I
look forward to that. Yeah.
Maybe like Flowers in the Dirt or something.
Yeah, let me know. You just let me know and we'll sort something out.
And to everyone out there, this has been Paul or Nothing. I'm going to go to bed now, as I had a very late night last night. Good show. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you. Okay.
And to you folks, tune in next time. And till then, see you next time, folks. The music's probably already playing. Take care. Bye.